All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Archaeology with Flint Dibble. And I'm assuming people can hear me. I always have to make that assumption, but I'm assuming so since Matt could hear me. So I am here with Dr. Matt Morgan, and he is an intensive care physician who works for NHS. And in fact, he has a night shift tonight. So, he is out there saving lives. And he's also associated with Cardiff University here. So he's one of my colleagues and friends. And so I thought it would be great to have him on because he just, oh, wait, I needed to add this 1 second. He just published a new book called A Second Act, which once I get this set up, you'll see on screen. There we go. So A Second Act, and it's about what nearly dying teaches us about really living, which is just such a cool topic. Okay, people are saying the audio is good. Fantastic. Hey, everybody. Hey, everyone. So we want to talk about this book. We can talk about some of the historical ways behind this and things like that, and talk about how we can think about this in our world. I mean, I think I talked about this with Matt before. I just had my own brush with death with cancer. It's a little different from a near-death experience, but at the same time, it does give you a sense of mortality. So I'd love to discuss some of that as well. So I mean, what inspired you to write this book on such a morbid topic? I mean,
well, the truth is the book isn't about death, it's about life. But like all topics, when you look at where the direction of light is coming from, you need to look in the shade to work it out. And it's the same here. Steve Jobs said death is life's greatest invention. Now, it doesn't feel like that when you're in the intensive care unit or when you have a cancer diagnosis, as you say. But I've worked now as a doctor for 20 years. I'm constantly looking after people in that weird fog between life and death. And I've met hundreds who have died, if you like, were resuscitated, so they had CPR and lived. And I've long thought it's these people we should be listening to, not the influencers, not the tech billionaires. It's these people that know what really matters in life. And I think it's been said, we all have two lives. We don't have one, we have two. But you realize you only have one. You realize the second when you realize you only have one. And there's different ways of getting there. Perhaps your cancer diagnosis forced that realization on you. And for the 10 people in this book who all died different ways, that's when their second life started, so to speak.
That makes sense. That's interesting. And I like the point about don't listen to the influencers. I think that's really important. I mean, there's that guy that always makes the news where he's trying to live forever or something like that by drinking his son's blood or something like that. It's like, maybe it's not drinking, I don't know, but he somehow I don't want to get life advice from somebody like that. I would much rather get life advice from somebody who has, had their brush with death and has some thoughts on that.
And more importantly for him, I think his name is Brian. I did a little research into him when I was writing this book. Yes, you might be able to, eke out an extra 10, 20, 30, even more years by doing all this stuff. But why? Life is there to be lived. Life is an emergency, just like intensive care. Life is an emergency. You don't want to arrive at that end having said, well, what have you done? Well, I've done nothing so that I live longer. You need to live. That's what life is for. And that balance is tricky, but that's the point.
I mean, that was certainly one of the things for me, my brush with my own mortality. It gave me the courage to do something like go on Joe Rogan and talk with Graham Hancock because, it was sort of like, well, screw it. I mean, like, what else am I going to do with my life that can actually have an impact in a sense? You can't just hide from what's going on around you. And so, I think that's true.
Yeah, and Flint, thank you for having me on this channel. I know it, and for people watching, they might want to find the deep mysteries of the past, and instead they've got me who uses drugs and machines and weird things. But actually, I was thinking about this a lot today, and working in medicine, working as a doctor, especially where I am in ICU, it's kind of super similar. What we do, the important thing what we do is we look at history of a patient by reading about their lives, by reading about what's happened in the past, using first-person narrative and perspective. We then do tests to try to know if that's accurate. And we use cool technology like you do, whether it's ultrasound, ground penetration laser, where we don't penetrate the ground, but we penetrate bodies. And we do that to, come to an evidence-based conclusion based on history and other things. And then we try to improve the future, which, what that's all about as well. And even when we can't, even when people die, 1 in 5 people that I look after tonight in intensive care will ultimately die. They won't survive. But I think what we're trying to do is make sense of a story. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you're very right. It's one of the reasons why I struggle talking with pseudoscientists online that try to argue that archaeology is not a science. And it's like, no, first of all, wait a second. Science is not perfect. If science was perfect, you would have no patients passing away, for example. And the reality is we have to make the best judgment calls we can with the information we have. And the other point I always try to make is that every decision we make in our lives, whether it's in the ICU or whether it's some other decision you make in your own life, is based on history. Yeah. So you mentioned the patient's history and things like that. That's part of it. Their family history. Same thing with, politicians making decisions. They're going off of history. Same thing with you. What are you going to do with your life? It's based off of your own experiences, and you make decisions like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So actually, like all scientific disciplines, they're quite similar. And I didn't always want to be a doctor. I told my careers tutor I wanted to be Fox Mulder from the X-Files. Actually, it was what I wanted to be. Which again is kind of similar. He tried to solve mysteries with technology and truth, and in order to improve the future. So perhaps I kind of do something similar, but without so many aliens.
There you go. I think that makes sense. I think you have less aliens and more life that's worth living. So, all right, a personal question. So part of you started off by talking about this book, and you mentioned how a kind of brush with death gives a sense of perspective, but you're someone who has brushes with death every day. And so I'm curious about how the perspective, before we jump into the content of the book and thinking about a patient or a person's experience with their own mortality, you're constantly confronted with mortality as a concept. How does that impact your own view on life?
Yeah, lots of people ask about that and ask about stress reactions because, it's true. Some days, maybe tonight, you'll need to make a decision within minutes. And if you make the wrong decision, that could be terrible. So there is stress there. But I think maybe I'm attracted to this specialty. Maybe I've been self-selected because I'm the kind of person that if I'm having a bad day, if I've had a flat tire today or a tax bill or the dog ran off or something happened, when I go to work tonight, I'll meet people and family for, I'm giving the worst news of their life and they've just met me. It just makes all of that insignificant. Like you said about going on Joe Rogan, what a stressful thing. But then in the, years prior, you had something a lot more stressful, which was cancer.
Yeah, exactly. So
I get that hack. It's a bit of a life hack. I get that for free. In fact, I'm paid to have that life hack. And it doesn't mean I don't have bad days or I don't shout at the dog or I don't get stressed. Of course I do. But it's an amazing way to pull back to reality. And my hope is maybe this book will allow others who don't do that kind of work to experience that kind of without needing to die.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's jump into the book then. So some of this comes off of some personal experiences, I'm assuming, from patients that you've known or treated, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Do you have any stories there you want to share that give some of the sense of perspective there?
Yeah, so the book contains 10 amazing stories of 10 people who have nearly died, all of which have had cardiac arrest, so their heart has stopped in one way or another. All of them were
specific to cardiac arrest. Okay.
Correct. Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
And all of them, have survived. I've looked after about half the people in the book, and then about half of the other patients have kind of remarkable stories. So I've found them and I've met with them and formed relationships with them. And the stories are super wide. There's a guy in here called Roberto who had the world's longest cardiac arrest. His heart stopped for 9 hours. He was very cold, because there's a saying, you're not dead until you're warm and dead. And he was buried in a snowstorm, so his body temperature was 24 when they found him, which is why he survived that long. And yet he survived, completely neurologically intact. He was at my book launch last weekend. We were at the pub together. It's a remarkable story. And then it goes all the way through to the other side of things. There's a patient in here called Summer who tried to take her own life. And she wasn't at the book launch last weekend. And the reason she wasn't there is because she was working. She was working as a mental health nurse. So she has gone, literally full circle, trying to help people so they don't do the thing that she did. So yeah, the medicine's remarkable, but so are some of the stories, actually.
Yeah, I think that's important. I mean, the medicine is there to help make sure we can keep telling those stories, let's say, or create those stories. That's what it's there for, to keep us alive and healthy. And yeah, it's amazing to see people turn that kind of leaf, in a sense. And that's really, really valuable. Was there a common thread in how some of these people responded to these kind of experiences?
Yeah, there are a couple of common threads. I guess, all of the stories are different, and it's not all milk and honey. Some people had really tough times. Survivor guilt is very common, and people struggle to come to terms with the new life. I think the common thread is there's kind of one message, if you like, from each of those 10 stories. And we'll probably talk about it at the end, but I kind of collected those 10 messages or lessons and tried to put them into practice in my own life. In fact, we had a live-in funeral as kind of the conclusion of the book. I'd finished writing it, and there was something missing. There was a way that I needed to somehow get closer to these people, and the only way I could think about it was to meet my own mortality through a funeral. So they do have kind of life lessons, 10 life lessons, if you like. But I think overall, what's the message from there? The message is probably that we all have 2 lives. You only realize you have one when you die, so to speak, and I think it's that realization. Terry Pratchett puts it much better. He says, it's said that life flashes before your eyes before you die. That's true. It's called life. And I think we all need to be snapped out of reality to realize that sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's always tough to get out of our own little perspective, especially when things are happening. I mean, we were talking before we went on about the cuts here at Cardiff University, and you get so focused on the bad and sometimes the good in your little pocket of the world that a larger perspective can be very valuable, if you see what I mean, to try to knock you out of it. I guess it's good to know that we have 2 lives instead of one. It's not as good as if we're cats. Cats have 9, as I've learned with my cat. My cat's died 3 times already.
Well, maybe there needs to be a cat version of this book in the future years. But I think, sadly, to counteract that, as well as having 2 lives, you also die twice, which is unfortunate. There's a story in the book about a lady called Jen who has a heart transplant. In fact, I met Jen's heart before I met her, because Jen's heart is in a museum in London in a big glass jar in the Hunterian Museum. And Jen needed a transplant because she had an inherited problem, which her mum died of. Her mum was called Sally. And in fact, her mum died during her heart transplant operation. And so Jen kind of faced life knowing what was ahead of her. And the message from Jen, which was surprising even for me, is that she says you die twice, once when your body dies, and the next time when someone stops saying your name. Because when Jen's mum died, all of her friends and family and school friends reacted like a lot of us do. We say, oh, I'm sorry. And then often we feel awkward. We move on. And I've changed, actually, since that. I now purposely lean in to loss. And if someone says, my mum died or my daughter died or someone died, I'll say, what was their name? Tell me about them. What did they love in life? So yeah, in terms of practical things, that's something that I've taken with me, really.
And that's really much an ancient Greek way of thinking, where if you think about the Iliad, Achilles died a good death, but he's remembered forever. We all know who he is, let's say. And so that was very much a concept there of trying to be remembered as a form, I suppose, of living. And we had that, we talked about this a lot when my dad passed. It was about, hey, we can make him live on through us by remembering him and honoring him and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah.
What was your dad's name, Flint?
His name was Harold. You're already practicing this, aren't you?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, his name was Harold. He was also an archaeologist, and and he passed away suddenly. The only time I was in the ICU was when he died. Yeah. So
yeah, and
I have no good memories of the ICU.
No, and sadly, one thing I would say is that we tend to be very good and focus on saving a life. We are less good at saving a death. And one thing I am pretty passionate about is bereavement support. So I'm patron of a charity in Wales called To Wish, which provides bereavement support for people. And because actually what you do in those minutes, days, months when someone dies, people say, is there an afterlife? And my answer is yes, there's definitely an afterlife. But it's for the people who are left behind. And it can change their lives a lot, actually. So I think we don't do death as well as we should. We should be as good at doing tracheostomies and procedures and lines as we are at managing death. And unfortunately, it's the procedures which kind of get all the sexy stuff and not those other aspects.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the people in our ICU were very compassionate, and we got to blast some music for him right before we turned off the machines and stuff like that, and so it was good. He had a big smile on his face when we played Lucy and the Sky with Diamonds.
Great song choice.
So we asked him if he liked the music, and he was like, yes, and that was like my last memory of him, unfortunately. But so I mean, it is a difficult topic. I mean, and I don't know. I think it's important to try to find hope, though, because it always is about those who are still living, if you see what I mean. And how to continue on and improve what's around you, because it was one of the things that made it tough to grieve, because we knew that he would not want us to be grieving. We knew he'd want us to be celebrating. And so, we worked very hard to try to do that. And when I gave my speech at his memorial, I made sure it was mostly stand-up comedy in many ways.
Absolutely. And I mentioned that living funeral. I'd actually gone to my great auntie Wynn's funeral. She was 97. She lived a remarkable life. She was in the war rooms on D-Day. She did amazing things in her life. I was asked to do a eulogy, and rather than that, I wrote her a letter, actually. And that's a great way of doing things that are difficult. The letter writing is kind of gone by the way. It's all emails and DMs. There's something about writing a letter to someone, a physical letter, especially when things are hard to say. So I wrote a letter to Auntie Wynn, and after her funeral, everyone kept saying, "Oh, it was an amazing funeral. She would have loved it. It had all her favorite music, favorite food, favorite people."
Yeah, exactly.
She would have loved it. So I thought, why wait to have a funeral until you die? I think everybody should probably have a funeral before they die, actually.
So what was your experience with that then? Yeah, describe your own funeral that you did.
Well, first
it strikes me as like a sitcom scene, by the way.
Hopefully there are no cameras there. Well, there were some. I wrote to the vicar at the church at the bottom of my road to start with, and said I'd quite like a funeral. And they wrote back and they said, well, you have to be Christian and dead. And that was a bit awkward because I was neither, probably. So instead, we had a group funeral with 7 friends. It made it a lot less kind of, hedonistic, a lot less nihilistic. We went away to a beautiful cottage, and all of the 10 lessons from the book, the different people, we put in place. So one of the lessons was about looking back at old photos. We had old photos of people there. There was one about music being the OS, the operating system to the human soul. My friend's an amazing musician. He played all our favorite songs. We had a reading. We had a eulogy written by our loved ones. Good food. We fasted for a bit beforehand, like they did in and this is when you will correct me, in the Euclidean mysteries, the Greek mysteries, which
Eleusinian mysteries.
yes,
Yeah.
I was introduced to that bizarrely by the actor Michael Sheen,
Okay.
who I was doing some medical advisory work for a play he was in called Nye, all about Naira Bevan, founder of the NHS. And I was telling him about this living funeral idea. And he said, "Oh, yeah, it's been done a lot before, just like the Greeks used to do." And that was it. So,
Yeah, you
I
told me
thought he
about
was
this, and I'm
clever.
telling you, they really didn't do that very much. But this is one of the problems: is everybody misunderstands ancient history and archaeology. So yeah, a little bit of pseudo history from Michael Sheen. Tell him he should come on my show, and we can put him on the right path.
Well, I'm sure he'd love to, and I'm doing him a disjustice. He told me
No, I
some
know.
bits about it, how it was a way of perhaps facing mortality and reinventing yourself and appreciating your life, and that's kind of that's what the funeral did really.
Yeah.
Although it did end up with 7 men in a hot tub, which the celebrant had never before seen after one of his funeral services. The 7 people that he'd just proclaimed as dead being there in a hot tub. So there you go.
There you go. And so, did doing this experience give you a different perspective on things? How did you find it?
Yeah, well, it made me make a big decision. I was living in Australia at the time. I was living in Western Australia, in Perth, where we'd moved as a family after COVID. I've got 2 girls. My wife's a teacher. And we moved not because we were unhappy, not because I was burnt out after COVID. We were just, I don't know, bored, I think. We needed variation. We needed something. And yet, what we were looking for, we didn't find there. We missed friends, family, culture, cynefin, which is the Welsh word for connection. So after that funeral, we returned home actually in a nice way. We had a great time in Australia, loved it there, met amazing people, and we're glad we came back.
So you did the funeral in Australia?
No, it was done in Europe. It was done in the foot
Okay.
of the Pyrenees during
Okay.
a trip home with my friends. But it was in the wake of that then that we all, for lots of reasons, decided to come home. But all of my friends actually who came, they've all made pretty big changes, whether it's job changes, some doing voluntary work, some taking trips that they've been putting off for the perfect time, which never seems to arrive.
Never.
So yeah, it was transformative in many ways, actually.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, one of the key things that death does remind everybody of is just how valuable life is.
Yeah.
And that can be, I had that feeling after my dad passed. I had that feeling when dealing with cancer. Even just thinking about it now, it's like, hey, that you have to get living. You have to do it as much and as intentionally as you can.
Yeah.
Because nobody's going to do it for you.
No, no. And, death and life it's like 11 and 1 on a clock face. They are super far away. You never expect it, but they're also super close, and it comes at the time you least expect. And ultimately, the cause of death is life. That's ultimately the cause. So,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
and I suppose what you were saying about ICU before, perhaps that's, again, I'm going to say a word that you're going to correct me on. Perhaps that's a bit of a stoical way of looking at things, negative visualization, what could happen. I kind of get that every day. And so, trying to focus on that good stuff rather than the bad stuff.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, you can't have good stuff without bad stuff. It's all about that duality between these things and how to negotiate them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I've always been of the attitude that you cannot live your life in a way that is like, I'm just trying to live longer. It's
No.
not worth it.
Yeah.
I would rather eat something less healthy than me for me, drink something less healthy for me, and enjoy my life. Because in the end, everything you do is slowly killing you yourself.
Yeah.
Whatever it is. It could be sleeping. It could be, yeah.
Cause of death is life. I'll throw a Hunter S. Thompson quote to you, which says, "Life should not be a journey to the grave with the intention of arriving safely in a pretty and well-preserved body, but rather to skid in broadside in a cloud of smoke, thoroughly used up, totally worn out and loudly proclaiming, "Wow, what a ride."
Exactly. That is how to live.
Yeah.
We can't live like that every moment,
No,
but we
yeah.
certainly need to live like that in general.
Yeah.
Like, yeah. So, okay, what took you on this journey for writing? You've written now. This is your third book. I also have this one, which is fantastic. It's on how animals teach us about medicine. And you're a phenomenal writer. You write in very short, exciting snippets, which sort of keeps a reader engaged. And so, what got you into this? Because it's the polar opposite of probably how you work as an ICU doctor, I would imagine.
Oh, well, thanks, Flint. That's very kind. And the truth is, I still don't describe myself as an author. I'm a doctor who writes, and kind of the reason I write is to scale that work. Much like you're doing. And the impact you can have. Tonight, I'll meet a maximum of 40 people. I can only ever influence their lives, and yet through a book, you can reach many more than your hands can. And for people watching, you don't have to be a writer to write. I was terrible at school at writing. I genuinely couldn't spell my own name. It only came to me when I was at an academic conference in Dublin. I did a PhD all about a type of immune cell, which is 0.04% of all your immune cells. That was 3 years of my life on that. Huh. So I was talking about that cell in a conference, and I felt quite good about myself. The talk went well, and I went out that night, had a Guinness or two, and somebody asked me what I did. I said, I'm at a conference. What's it about? Oh, it's about medicine. What kind of medicine do you do? This was before the pandemic. And I said, ICU. And they said, what's that? And it kind of struck me that, I spent a decade talking at conferences where no one's listening, writing papers. The average paper's read by 4 people, I think. Yeah. And I'd forgotten about, the important people, which is the world out there. And so I wanted to tell the story of ICU, which I did in the first book called Critical. And I enjoyed it, and people enjoyed it. And so I continued. So I suppose it's public engagement and this misinformation, which is, what's spurred you on to do things like this today, really.
Yes, I agree. I think that was something. I mean, for me, it just happened accidentally. I kind of joined Twitter, and this was like 7 years ago, I guess at this point. And so I just sort of wrote up some of my research into a thread, and I was shocked that like 1,000 people read that.
Yeah.
And so then I did another one, and 2,000 people read that, and then I got to the point where like 100,000 people are reading what I'm writing, and it's like, whoa, we actually have the ability with today's technology to, without any real promotion, to start reaching people. Yeah. And so, because for a while, a lot of my colleagues were saying, yeah, but the only people that read our posts on Twitter are our colleagues. And so, which is true, obviously, within your scholarly networks, that's most of who you follow, and that's most of who follows you. But if you really do try to push information out to the public and think through how to write it or say it in an accessible way and in an interesting way, people tune in. And that's why we have people tuning in right now, and people will watch the recording of this as well, and some will go check out the book. Let me drop the link back in there to the second act as well. So, yeah, I think it's really important that those of us with experience and expertise, we work harder to share that with the public, especially within today's world where there's so much misinformation out there. Yeah.
I think Derek Silver said, what's normal for you or usual for you is amazing to others. And it kind of doesn't matter how niche or weird your specialty is, my PhD involved flow cytometry, and it seems very boring. It's amazing, using lasers to look at stuff. How amazing is that? The work you do in terms of your field exercises that I've looked at, that's amazing. And I think increasingly having the people who are doing that talk about it is important as well. Not just through third hand, through, as through documentaries about people who don't really know what they're saying. Having that primary source is more important than ever, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's that ability to try to make an authentic connection, which fortunately we have the technology to do that on a level unlike before. I think that's the kind of thing that like Joe Rogan, for example, does really well. He's able to speak in a way that's very accessible and relatable to people. And I think those of us who are academics or scholars or doctors or whatever, experts in various topics, we need to learn to try to leverage these tools to do that, because making that kind of personal plea, that personal connection with some empathy and some emotion, that's how we can get people to start learning from us and recognize that science is not on a pedestal.
Yeah.
The people who are doing science, who are saving lives, who are digging in trenches, we're just like everyone else.
Yeah.
And so, we have the same basic issues, problems, struggles, desires, joys, etc. And so, I think that's really key to show that we really are just normal people.
Yeah.
And it's something we are approachable even and understandable. So yeah, I firmly believe in trying to get ourselves out there and humanize us, if you will.
Although it can be hard, and I know you've encountered the other side of that too. I had a minor slice of that in COVID, when I would do stuff at home when I'm after a 12-13 hour shift, talking about some of the evidence or some of the things that's come out that week. The most stressful time in COVID for me, was probably in my own home rather than caring for people in hospital. That should have been the stressful bit. It was like having the postman, scream swear words through your letterbox, the kind of feedback, shall we say, that came through social media.
So you're saying you got because people were targeting you on social media.
Yeah. And like you say, I love questions. There's nothing better in life than questions. Being wrong is amazing. The best bit about science is finding out you're wrong. There are malincentives in that system sometimes, but most scientists who are worth their money love being wrong. That's why they do experiments to find out what's wrong rather than what's right half the time.
Of course.
But there's a big gulf between helpful feedback, shall we say, and stuff that isn't. And I do worry that nuanced conversation is hard, even with long podcast forms which allow nuance. It's tough through many of the ways that we conduct it.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is now we're all just getting our information from so many different sources, and we're ingrained in us who to trust and who not to trust. So even though you have the time to give that nuance, well, people are ingrained to hate archaeologists if they've been listening to certain pseudo-archaeologists. People are ingrained to hate medical doctors if they've been listening to certain pseudoscience influencers. And so it's very difficult to break down those kind of barriers. And I mean, that was, as I've always told people with my experience on Rogan talking to Graham Hancock, was I never really expected to have many Graham Hancock fans listen to me and be convinced. I mostly was shooting for other people who were interested but didn't really know and didn't have strong feelings on the topic. So I was shocked that I broke through with many of them. And I've always been thinking about how and why. And I mean, I know what I did to prepare, but why was I somewhat more successful than other scholars and scientists? I don't know. I think some of it was I was an unknown factor when I went on there. I think that helped. While now I'd be a known factor, I think if I was to do it again, like a round 2, I don't think I'd be able to reach any of the people that are still Hancock fans. Maybe other people, but not those that are entrenched in it. And so that's part of the issue, is having that unknown factor is useful. But as soon as somebody says, Dr. Matt Morgan, I see you, doctor, boom, you're in a group.
I think perhaps one thing that we perhaps didn't do as all science perhaps should have done better, especially in the times of COVID. And this is something you did a lot on Rogan show, which perhaps is one reason why. I often say that if the 3 most important words in life are I love you, probably the 3 most important in medicine and probably in science too are I don't know. And yet saying I don't know is hard, especially when you're faced with a family, asking, will my daughter survive? They don't want me to say, I don't know. But
Yeah,
the truth is, I don't know.
Yeah.
But there is hope in those words too, because if the truth is I don't know, well, the actual outcome may be yes, maybe she will survive. So how do you navigate uncertainty? And I guess in your field, there's not only uncertainty in kind of the techniques or the statistical noise, but there's a lot being made about stuff we haven't looked, or the places we haven't looked, or the detail we haven't looked. In uncertainty is inherent in science.
Exactly. But it's hard though, because I do say I don't know all the time. But the people that dislike me, they refuse to acknowledge I ever say that.
Yeah.
Right? They say I say there's no mysteries, and they accuse me of saying that I know everything, and that it's telling them that there's no mysteries out there, and therefore we shouldn't do archaeology. And it's like, that is the exact opposite of what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You're just misrepresenting me. But and that's part of, like I said, the issue. You get put in those boxes,
Yeah.
and some people are going to listen to you and some people aren't. And I just sort of figure we just have to talk to people who are willing to listen to us and be as accessible and approachable as we can. And maybe some people who are not willing to listen to us now will be willing to later on.
Yeah.
And that's just how it is. We just have to keep speaking up, though, is key. Yeah.
What about the combating? One thing I struggled with a bit in those times, especially of COVID, is my first kind of strategy, if you like, that I would use would be to acknowledge uncertainty, discuss back, and often then offer counterfactuals and evidence. But about halfway through, I looked into the kind of scientific literature on how to, get those points across. And there is a big literature that says, even the act of discussing, or even the act of counterfactual discussions, it seldom works, in inverted commas, i.e. people seldom change their mind, and actually sometimes it entrenches views even more. So I struggle to know how to manage that in that latter stage. In fact, I started doing less back and forth, and perhaps more separate public engagement of science through writing in newspapers and radio shows and things with nuance. So how do you balance that? When do you write back, and do you think that helps?
I mean, so I think from what I've read, because this is obviously is one, different people are going to be convinced in different ways.
Yeah.
So in some cases, mocking people can actually be effective. Because it varies from person to person, right?
Yeah.
And in other cases, being more empathetic is going to get across. And so I think there's no magic recipe.
No.
Is the key here. And so I think we need all is one of the key things here. I do think that another thing we need to recognize is that there are bad faith actors out there, though.
Yeah.
And so we need to also temper everything we do with that in mind. And so we need to pay attention to research into misinformation and disinformation, because there are times to engage with those bad faith actors, but doing so, you need to be very strategic, if you see what I mean, and think through how to pre-bunk them and do truth sandwiches and not debunk them and not give them the floor, or at least as little as possible. And so, but it's something that I've struggled with as well, because people say, well, can I take your strategy and apply it to my brother or my sister who's caught up in this stuff? And it's like, no. The strategy I took was more for a large-scale public communication as a way to combat a bad faith actor who's spreading misinformation.
Yeah.
You don't do that when you're talking with a loved one who trusts you.
No.
You want to have more of a nuanced conversation that is going to be different. And so, I think there's room for all of this, is what I'm saying. And when I give like lectures at universities or to groups of experts, my main point is speak up. Speak up. It doesn't mean you need to be pushing back against misinformation, but share your experience, your expertise, share what gets you interested in your field. The more of us that speak up, the louder we all are, the bigger of an ecosystem we have. That's what we need to do, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So yeah, what are your thoughts? So you were dealing with this. You were going on TV during COVID and stuff like that, and communicating with the public. And I mean, I imagine what you got is far worse than what I get. I see what like Peter Hotez and other physicians get, and it is been way beyond the kind of hatred I get.
Yeah, it was, like I said, it was one of the more stressful bits of the pandemic, bizarrely, partially because there aren't walls. Obviously, if you open up an app on your phone while sitting on the sofa with your family at night, there it is, and that's different. That was partially me learning how to deal with stuff and, having barriers around what I would and wouldn't do. But equally, I think, it had better scale effect than I could in the intensive care unit. I still worked there full time. But, the truth was, as weird as the pandemic was, for people like me, I went to work in the place I always go to work. I did a similar job. I got paid, and so for a lot of other people, the pandemic was far more stressful than me because they didn't have work. They didn't get paid. They didn't do all those other things. So, and in a weird way, ICU was born in a viral pandemic. It was born in 1952 when the Copenhagen polio epidemic came out. There was a little girl called Vivi who was 12, who was blue on the floor with polio, and they'd run out of the last machine, the last iron lung. And so a doctor made a hole in her neck instead, put in a plastic pipe, a tracheostomy, squeezed the bag, and then got teams of medical students to squeeze that bag for Vivi for days, weeks, months, and over 100 other children. And so that's where intensive care was born. And bizarrely, in COVID, the word intensivist was put in the dictionary for the first time. So it was kind of born in a pandemic in 1952, and then kind of grew up, if you like. And people know more about ventilators during that time than I did, So yeah, it's a strange circular history in many ways.
So what's your impression on public communication during the pandemic? I mean, obviously it's a challenging environment. People are trapped inside and they're going online, and it's an environment where there's so many unknowns. And so therefore, as let's say a medical communication expert, you have to say something, but it's based off of a lot of unknowns. And you need to clarify that, but you're still trying to get people to, stay inside and take vaccines and things like that. So I don't know. Well, what's the lesson? How do we learn how to do better than we did now that we see the kind of environment that the internet creates for these kind of situations? How do we communicate medicine better? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think probably the time to do it is not in a pandemic.
Yes.
The time, I often say to families, I talk about difficult things with families when the seas are calm, not when the seas are rough. So if I'm going to say things like, I'm worried about your dad, he's sick enough to die, I want to tell you that, not when he's dying or when he's having a cardiac arrest. I want you to tell you about that when he's stable, actually. That's the time to talk about stuff. So it's a boring answer, but it comes down to education, trust in institutions, and also dealing with uncertainty. I suppose if there's one thing people could have done better in the pandemic, especially in the UK, trust in institutions was evaporated thanks to the behaviour of some in healthcare policy that shall remain nameless in government. But I think perhaps we didn't talk about uncertainty enough. Rather than say, you should definitely do X, perhaps we should have said, look, there's always uncertainties. Nothing in life is certain. What we know now, option A is definitely the right choice overall, but there is uncertainty. I think dealing with nuance and uncertainty is probably something we didn't do particularly good at, or didn't do well at.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think there's also research that shows projecting confidence, though, helps more people go along with ideas. And so it's this. And then, as I mentioned, I explain uncertainty all the time, but people ignore it and pretend I'm not. Because my memory of the pandemic and the communication was doctors were saying, we don't know, but this seems to be the best course of action. That's my remembrance of of the communication. And people tell me, no, we were told blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't know. My memory of it was, this is a new disease. We don't know what to do. So we're trying to figure out what to do. And this is our recommendations for now. They will change, though, with more information. That's how I remember it. But other people remember it very differently.
And statistics is so complicated is the problem. Even when you think about things like pre-test probabilities and population prevalence, you can have a test which is 99% accurate, but if the population prevalence of the thing you're testing for is extremely rare, the pre-test probabilities mean that it's actually, you'll have a lot of inaccurate tests, even though it's 99% accurate. It takes me a lot to get my head around the complexity of statistical diagnostics, Bayesian statistics, and other things. It's hard.
Of course.
Yeah.
As humans, we are terrible with statistics.
Yeah.
And bad actors are also out there that shade statistics for whatever reason. As I discussed a couple days ago on here with Cardiff University, the way they are presenting the statistics of the proposed cuts is extremely misleading. And so, I think that's one of the difficulties with statistics, is there's so many ways to present them. And I work in a field where I use a lot of statistics, so that's why I wrote that thread. And I'm actually going to work with a medical statistician at Cardiff University to better analyze the statistics from those announcements, so that we can get to the bottom of what those cuts mean. But sorry, I went off on a tangent here. But yes, stats are really hard, and how to actually do action based off of stats. It's like doing it based off of history. We were talking about that in the beginning. It's difficult, but we have to use both history and statistics to be able to inform our decisions. For sure.
And it's particularly hard then using population stats and drilling it down to an individual. That's another level of complexity. All the time we look at the likelihood of poor outcomes of people in ICU based on large data sets, but that means nothing for that person, that one person. And marrying those two, it's a bit like the problem in physics of Newtonian gravity versus quantum gravity. How do you marry those two things? That you've got all these beautiful theories, it all works, everything works, the statistics work, and then for that one, electron, for that one person, means nothing. And
exactly. In the end, population statistics are meaningless for every individual. It's just about what to do on average. Which that reminds me, thinking about this, is I've heard, for example, that there's extraordinary life-saving measures that doctors can do, right? But for many of them, the chances of them working are low, and they can lessen your quality of life. So I've always heard people say, well, doctors don't want those kind of treatments on themselves, so therefore you should not want that on yourself. What's your perspective on sort of living wills and stuff like that? Just your personal perspective, of course. Are there certain treatments you would never want, or on average, maybe not never, but on average, or what? Would you do anything to save your life? How would you deal with your own life in that sense?
Yeah, that's a great shout. I think I've got 29 colleagues in ICU of all different ages and health backgrounds and everything else. And I think, very few of us would want, towards the end of our known life, want to come to ICU. And that's, even though we're working in the field, in a way, the best way to survive ICU is not go there in the first place. So it should, it should all be about preventive medicine. What I wouldn't do is, when I'm in my 70s, 80s, or if I've got other measures of frailty or issues, I would never use a ladder. I wouldn't wear slippers, and I would sit down to take a pee because of all of the problems I see. People fall off ladders, Christmas decorations, roofs, people falling on stairs in the middle of the night, going to the toilet, people getting up from the toilet. It's the boring things in life that get you.
Of course,
I think those are probably the way.
Wait, did you say slippers?
Slippers, correct. Yeah.
So that's a leading cause of accidents because they're slippery, I guess?
There are public health campaigns about having high quality slippers. and they probably do more good than quite a lot of the big public health campaigns. So if you
Like
look at
because
trauma,
of the grip on them, or
yeah,
what?
yeah,
Okay.
nice, very slippery soles, especially on maybe wooden stairs or stonework,
Okay.
and
Huh.
ladders. Ladders should be sold with a warning. It should be hard to get a ladder,
I
because
could see that one being
yeah,
common. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, because I think especially as you're younger, you
mm,
overestimate your ability sometimes to balance yourself. I always get mad at my wife. She does this all the time. She's like a goat. She'll climb crazy things and
okay.
precarious. I'm like, Yoni, I'm gonna kill you if you don't kill yourself. Because yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know. So what's your philosophy on life then?
Wow. Yeah, I think my philosophy on life, probably three things. The good life probably needs, yes, it needs a baseline of physical possessions and things. And that is the ability to pay your mortgage and to feed your children and things. But the most important things in life are not things. So I think it's about meaning, it's about experience, and there's some simple changes to do that. This Christmas, what did I buy my family? We went and did pottery. I didn't buy them physical goods. We are terrible at pottery. In fact, I've got to pick up the pots, and it's embarrassing because they're all deformed. But you don't do stuff because you're good at it. You do stuff because you enjoy it. You enjoy the connections. You enjoy the meaning. And I suppose the third bit in life is variation. So for me, you need an amount of things, but the most important things in life are not things. They're actually meaning, and that can come through work, through family, through hobbies. Hobbies you're bad at. And the third thing is variation. And I think if you manage to have all three of those in some combination, that sounds like a pretty good life to me.
That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. Okay, so do we want to talk a little bit about your other book really quickly, just because it's a topic I like, and this is about how animals can teach us about our health and about why the animals matter. So this is something I'm very keen on because I study ancient animals, and so in that sense, I find it interesting to see how animals can teach us about medicine in many ways. What was your takeaway on that? How did you get into that kind of topic?
Yeah, so I'd written my first book, Critical. It came out in 2019. That was all about intensive care. It kind of rode that wave of medical memoirs that was popular at the time, and that was my entry into writing. It was always a two book deal, if you like, and the publishers were asking about book two, and it was a topic I loved. I loved comparative physiology. And it all started, and this is the truth, I was looking after a patient who had had a cardiac arrest. They had actually choked on a biscuit. And I'd cycled to work that morning in Cardiff along Butte Park, where we met and walked previously. It was a hot day. I was on my bike. And when I arrived at work, I had loads of little flies on my face. And as we were caring for this patient who choked on a biscuit, who survived, thankfully, there was a flock of birds that went past the window. And I thought, why don't they choke? Not on biscuits. But what about the flies on my face? Why aren't birds choking? And so that night, rather than revise for my exams, I read a textbook. Well, I bought a textbook. It's behind me on the shelf. It's Smith's Animal Physiology. And I just got lost in this book. The animals have such crazy adaptations, and I meet people at the brink of life, and we have to think about crazy adaptations. And we think we're very clever by coming up with these techniques. And yet in that book behind me, how a giraffe breathes is the way that we ventilate people with asthma. We've only worked that out in the last 20 years. There's a fish called the ice fish that has no hemoglobin in its blood. And yet we struggle. How do we manage people who don't want blood transfusions, like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example? Well, the ice fish has been doing it for 200 million years. Why do kangaroos have 3 vaginas? And actually, that proved crucial in understanding how to adapt the technology of IVF, which resulted in Louise Brown being born in the 60s. So, yeah, animals have been doing this for a lot longer than we have. And what Winnie the Pooh says is a lot of people talk to animals, but not many people listen. So hopefully, this book was a way of listening.
Yeah, it really vibed with me because the very first class I taught when I was a grad student, I was just thrown in to teach this class. It was like a class our classics department had to offer, which was Greek and Latin roots for medical terms. And so I taught that to pre-nursing students and pre-med students. And so, I'm reading like Galen and Hippocrates to prepare a lecture that's really boring. The lecture is just kind of like, well, we named cardia after cardia, which is Greek for heart, right? That kind of thing. And I was trying to get them to learn the ways in which vocabulary makes sense, because if you understand these Latin and Greek roots, it helps you put together the really complex combinations that they show up in medical terms. And so I tried to make that go down a little easier with some fun stories. So one of the stories that I recall vividly is how we learned how the nervous system works and nerves. So nerves are some of my favorites in many ways, for two reasons, actually. One of them is the etymology of them, which is nerve itself comes from the Greek word for tendon, and they use it for like the string of a bow, for example, for shooting a bow and arrow. And it's because they're long and stringy. And that's also why an aneurysm has the same root as nerve, even though an aneurysm has to do with blood vessels and a blockage in it, right? And so that's why, even though they're very not related in what they are in your body, they have that same etymology of nevros.
Love that.
And but what I liked was, it's a grim story, but it's a story about how Galen, what he did is he learned about nerves by operating on a dog. And back 2,000 years ago, all operations were in public. There'd be a crowd that would gather. And so he showed how if you carefully expose the nerve for the voice box, what he would do is he would beat the dog. Don't do this at home. The dog would start barking. Like I said, it's a grim story. But then he would slice that nerve to the voice box. And when he beat the dog would look like it was barking, but it wouldn't make any noise. So then he did it again, where he got another dog and he exposed this nerve again and he beat the dog again. And then the dog starts barking. And then he tied a thread over the nerve, beat the dog. It would not make any noise while barking. But then he undid the thread and then he beat the dog again and it made a noise. And so that's actually how 2,000 years ago, I would never say to do this to dogs. I love dogs.
Just heard you.
I love dogs. I love cats. It's just an interesting story. That's all it is. But it shows how we learned, and it's kind of interesting. I would never say that's how we should do medical tests today. We obviously shouldn't.
But it's true. Comparative physiology led to massive advances in human health, and it's still true to this day. And some of the work of the book also says that we need to rekindle this relationship with animals and this equal reciprocity relationship. So, for example, people walking around with hip and knee replacements, the reason you can have those is because they were all trialed on dogs and other mammals, and yet many animals you can't license those technologies or drugs to be used in those animals. So just like pharma companies are now offering reduced price medications to countries that can't afford them, for example, perhaps there should be some I can't say the word reciprocity for the animals, which allowed us to have those technologies in the first place, for example. There's some crazy giraffes are probably my favorite animal, and not only can giraffes help us with asthma and brain injuries, the skin technology was how anti-gravity suits work, because when giraffes run, all the blood runs down to their feet, so they have anti-gravity suits in their skin. but they can also prove that evolution wasn't by intelligent design, which I love. Talking about nerve, there's a nerve called the recurrent laryngeal that runs under a kind of embryological arch, a branchial arch. And in humans, what it means is it comes from kind of your brain to your voice box via this weird arch. And that's no big deal. But in a giraffe, it goes from their brain 2 meters down its neck, curves around the arch, comes 2 meters back up the other way to its voice box. So probably not.
It shows how that
design.
evolutionarily came about. That's interesting. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Another fun story about differences anatomically is the etymology for rectum. So your rectum, right? And so that literally the term that ancient medicinal authors used was rectum intestinum, which means the straight intestine. And the reason why is in some animals that part of the intestine is straight, but not in humans. So it is not the straight intestine in humans, but because it came from autopsies, I guess, of animals or butchering animals, that's where the name came from.
It was straight.
And so it's a misnomer, but it's stuck, and that's your rectum, the straight intestine that's not straight.
Love. Speaking of rectums, I don't say that very often. One of the amazing things about publishing a book is you can go on Kindle and see what passages readers have highlighted the most. And after writing this book, One Medicine, it was probably 4 years of research. I traveled all over the world. I met these animals. COVID had happened. It was a really fun book to write. A lot of work, but really fun. I wanted to know the passages people had highlighted the most. And out of all that science, all of that work, the passage they highlighted the most, I'll see if I can remember it. I don't think I've got it written down. It went something like, in embryological terms, we all start life from the bottom up. In other words, we all start life as an arsehole. Some people never change. And it was,
that is poetry. See, this is why you're such a good writer, because you have that nice, sweet, pithy way of an accessible way of explaining a complicated topic in a way that people understand. Because the one I was telling you about beforehand that always stuck with me is you start life with a mouthful of shit. And so, and
that relates to the microbiome. And, when I lived in Western Australia, there were koalas there, which had been imported because they're not native to Western Australia. And when they were first imported, they all died. They couldn't digest the local eucalyptus species. And the reason for that is the microbiomes, so the bugs that live inside your intestine, were the wrong ones to digest that type of eucalyptus. So zookeepers knew this. They've always known if you move to different areas, you need to do something pretty disgusting, because when koalas are born, they all actually physically eat their mother's what's called pap or feces when they're born. There's videos of them just chunking on it. And the reason they do that is to transmit the microbiome to allow you to eat eucalyptus. So the zookeepers imported feces from koalas on the East Coast, fed it to the Western Australian ones, and they're fine. And in fact, humans are naturally born with our mouth towards the rectum, the non-straight bit of the bowel. And if you look at babies born the wrong way round, if you like, or OP, which is the technical term, so face to the front, they have a completely different microbiome. They are more likely to develop autoimmune disease and diabetes. So this whole sphere of fecal transplants, as it's now called, koalas have been doing this for 200 million years.
Yeah, I think that's crazy. And I've noticed, so I have an autoimmune disease, I have Crohn's disease. And I remember at some point it was trendy. There was some underground cure, which was they were selling shit pills, literally, to try to improve your microbiome. For me, what cured my Crohn's disease was not eating onions and garlic, oddly enough.
Wow.
But I'm glad I didn't get into the shit pills, but it makes it tough to go out to eat when I can't eat onions and garlic. But
yes,
it is what it is.
That's restrictive.
Yeah.
And the book, in fact, I don't know if you've met George Nash.
No, I know who it is, but no.
Yeah, so he's one of the big experts on cave art in Europe. And towards the end of the book, the grand plan for the book was I'd end it in the Galapagos, and following the footsteps of Darwin, etc. And this is when COVID happened, so that was all quashed and all cancelled. And instead, I ended up with a chap with a big beard called George in the Gower in South Wales, so not too far from us, in an underground cave, where he's found one of the oldest pieces of cave art in the UK, possibly in Europe.
I think this was reported recently. Yeah, again.
Yes, I think 20 to 40,000 years. I think dating is tricky, but it was a scraping on the wall of this cave of a giant. I think it was a giant red deer. And what was amazing is we used to have a relationship with animals. The person who did that, it was anatomically correct in the right proportions. They knew where they fed. They knew their anatomy. They knew their life cycle, and that's broken. We now meet animals as a layer in our sandwich. That's the most common way we meet them, and so something needs to be done. And although the book is kind of funny and it's got good stories in it, there's a serious bit which is a broader issue. We should be training together. Why aren't doctors and vets learning together? Why aren't veterinary nurses, topical for Cardiff University, and human nurses, why aren't we training together? Why do we have different oaths, for example? I swear an oath.
Well, soon there's going to be no more nurse training at Cardiff anyway,
Yeah, quite. Yeah, which, we look at the needs of the NHS at the minute, and it just doesn't fit together.
It's so short-sighted.
So yeah, and that's science per se. I think having you come and train doctors and nurses and physicians, what an amazing rounded education. The humanities and science, makes the story make sense.
I was really pleased because by the end of that class, most of not all the students, you're never going to get all the students, but most of the students actually came around and realized that learning a little bit of Greek and Latin, or actually, sorry, one of my key points I wanted to make was if you discover something, don't name it after yourself. Because, and I always use the example of Crohn's disease because I hate Dr. Crohn, right? And but no, the real reason not to name something after yourself is because if you use Greek and Latin, it actually makes the job of future students easier because you're putting it into a system of verbiage, of vocabulary that makes sense. It's actually, there's a structure to scientific and medical language because these terms come from Greek and Latin that makes it easier to learn the thousands of really complex terms you have to learn. Yeah. But if everybody starts naming words after themselves, now you're introducing all these extra terms that end up being things people need to learn. Yeah. And so they all promised me at the end of the class that if they discovered something medically, they would make sure to do it in Greek and Latin because it would make future students' jobs that much easier.
That much easier.
If you see what I mean, yeah.
And that's what annoys me so much about divisions. Medicine is a humanity. I think it was said it's the most humane of the scientists of the sciences, the most scientific of the humanities. Now you could argue about that, but medicine is a language as much as it's science, and language is as much a science as it is a humanity. So we've lost this rounded education to the businessology of universities, and this isn't just a problem for some universities. This is a existential crisis. The wood and the trees. The point of universities isn't a spreadsheet with finance. The point of universities is the acquisition of knowledge, creativity, discovery, and a richness to cultural life. And I'm worried about that across the globe, and especially here, really.
I am too. So let's move on to some questions, maybe. First off, let's put that note there because I have fancy things I can do now. We do have a question for you right now, though. You're really interesting. Great guest. Do you have a YouTube channel or a podcast or anywhere that people can find you more regularly?
Yeah, so I guess I'm on all the normal socials. If you type in Dr. Dr. Matt Morgan, Instagram, Twitter, and so on. There is a YouTube channel. It's got a couple of videos on. I'm an amateur that needs to get better at it. I've done a lot of podcast stuff, so there's a lot out there that I'm a guest on, but I don't have my own.
Okay. That's good to know. And you're all the way out there. If people search for you, though, you have a name, of course, that is common enough that maybe it can be tough.
Yeah, I'm not a wrestler. I'm not a American wrestler, which is the other Matt Morgan.
Aha. Arendelle mentions that the NDERF, which I guess is the Near Death Experience Research Foundation, is looking for volunteers.
Yeah.
So definitely support that kind of research.
Well,
and
funny you should say. So one question I get asked a lot is about near-death experience, and probably about half of the patients in the book report something like that. Often it's white lights, often it's a life review, it's the presence of people there. But amazingly, there is a scientific experiment where an 87-year-old who had a terminal disease, he was having some brain scans done for unrelated reasons, and he actually died during those brain scans. They were functional MRIs and EEGs. And the bits of the brain that lit up as he died, here's the punchline, they were the parts which are associated with seeing light, seeing bright light especially, parts associated with memory, especially imagery and memory, and parts associated with kind of ethics or presence or consciousness. So I think it's probably true. When you die, you see a white light, you probably see or think about images from the past, and you probably have that existential sense of things. And that's not because of God or any other reasons. It's probably because of neuronal death. So yeah, I think that's probably a factual based thing.
Huh. Okay, that's interesting. I did not know that. I do know when I've gone under from anesthesia, I have noticed a flash once. So that I just figured that was part of it. But yeah, another nice comment that was from earlier in the chat that I wanted to point out was, Matt, that is profound. When I lost my life partner, all my friends and colleagues felt awkward and avoided me.
Yeah.
And so I think that this is important. It's awkward for all of us when some of these things happen, but we need to do our best to overcome that awkwardness, because we have to be there for people that we are working with or friends with or colleagues or friends or family. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes, it's not buying flowers or going out it's simple stuff. Sometimes, it's saying, are you missing your dad? What are you thinking about? Tell me about your dad. Tell me about your mum. Because it's actually not only does one person die, sometimes the person left behind, you're absolutely right. Jen described how her friends didn't talk to her in school, and it's as if she had died as well as her mum. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Yeah. And then, just on the other note, I definitely want to have Matt back on at some point. As I think I've mentioned somewhere, I'm hoping to eventually level up to the point of in-person interviews. And since Matt is in town, he's a great person to have back on for maybe like a really extended sit down on kind of fighting misinformation and stuff like that from a medical point of view, from a historical, archaeological point of view. I think the two of us could really hopefully have a very productive conversation that people could hear different perspectives on from that. And so stay tuned. You'll see Matt back on here again at some point in the future. I can guarantee it. Yeah. And any last points or thoughts you have?
No, Flint, first of all, thank you for all you do. It's amazing how you've expanded out from your core into other things, and you're an amazing advocate for sense, science, and uncertainty. So thank you. And equally, thank you to your audience for tuning in, listening, and supporting this. Please support this podcast and other things Flint does, because it's so important. I'll just leave you with one last thought, really. I think everyone should have a funeral before you die, and life should be a verb, not a noun. Life's about doing stuff, not being something, and I think you're a testament to that. So thank you.
That's a good way to put it. I like that. You're good with these pithy sayings, man. While I still have people here, I do want to make one last final thing, which is about these cuts, When I talked about them 2 days ago, there were no petitions out at that point. Now there are petitions to sign. So let me get my screen back up here, and I'll put the links into the chat. So the first one is the one that is near and dear to me, which is please save Cardiff University's ancient history degree. I have many colleagues that are under threat because of this, and they're really, really good ancient historians. The students have put together these petitions, and so please share, sign and share with others. There's also a petition to save Cardiff University School of Nursing, which is we've talked about several times today, because that's a major cut that is also going to have a serious impact on Welsh health, because we need to be able to train nurses here. They're cutting the entire School of Nursing, which is just, it's so short-sighted. It's all so short-sighted. And then last one is save Cardiff University School of Music, because they're also cutting the entire School of Music. In the end, it's humanities and nursing that are being cut, and just drastically. It's going to make a very different university. So please, everybody, sign all 3 of these petitions. I've already signed all of them. Please go share them. It's really, really important that we try to build as much public support as possible against these cuts. I don't know if anybody's seen the news, but Cardiff University has significant cash reserves. There is no need to be making such a drastic decision. Yes, people everywhere in the world can sign them. Everywhere in the world, all the public support that we can get for these different programs is going to help to fight back against these cuts. I can't imagine we're going to save everything, but everything we can save is better than nothing. So yeah, I think we have to all speak up as best we can to stop. We've talked on this channel many times about fighting misinformation and real science, supporting real science and scholarship. Part of it is making sure our voices are heard, that we don't want these kind of cuts to education, right? We have to do that. I have another banner on that, don't I? Do what you can to support education and science in your community, and your community, you should think about your community both locally and globally, because we're all part of the same community no matter where you are. And these cuts impact all of us, even if they do impact those of us in Cardiff much more than people elsewhere. It has an impact on the world at large. So please share, sign these petitions, and go check out Matt's book. Let me get that back up here one more time. Where did it go?
I'll do this like cheat.
A second act. Yeah, you show it. It is. I'm looking forward to reading it. Like I said, I read his book, One Medicine, and it is absolutely captivating. He has a great way of writing. Check out a second act. And I'll be having several more authors on soon, actually. So stay tuned. I want to promote all this kind of good books that are written on all kinds of science topics and history topics for everybody out there, because there's so many good books out there. We need to get back to reading. Yeah. And I love it, people tuning in, but also make sure to read. Yeah, and Arendelle makes a good point. Hit the like button, share this podcast, get the word out. Yeah. And sorry, Sarita, you missed it. You can watch the replay. Remember, everybody, the replays are all under the live tab on my YouTube. All right. Thank you all. See you all later.
Thanks. Cheers.